Let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to picture this. Place yourself in a neighbor's living room on the early morning of August 13th, 2018. A police officer is standing right there, staring at a television screen that's playing back security footage from the home's driveway camera. And right next to the officer is a husband, just nervously pacing back and forth, watching himself on that exact same screen. That husband is Chris Watts, and he is desperately, almost frantically, over-explaining to the police why his truck was backed up to his garage at 5 a.m. This happens to be the exact same morning his 15-week pregnant wife, Shanann, and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, practically vanished into thin air. He claims he was just loading tools for work. Oh, and a lunchbox, too. But if you watch closely, if you really look at his body language, something in that room feels completely off. The neighbor, Nathaniel Trinastich, the guy whose camera actually captured the footage, immediately spots the cracks in Chris's demeanor. Literally, the second Chris steps outside, Nathaniel turns to the police and says, "I just don't understand why he keeps explaining himself over and over. He doesn't look worried. He looks like he's trying to cover his tracks." It is an absolutely chilling observation that shatters this initial illusion of a concerned husband. And Nathaniel goes even further, revealing to the police that the supposedly picture-perfect couple next door actually had some pretty dark secrets. He had heard them having these full-out screaming fights at the top of their lungs. So the investigation hasn't even fully started, and already the narrative is completely cracking. So, we have to ask the most unsettling question right up front. What happens when the perfect family suddenly vanishes? Because friends and family were instantly alarmed. The circumstances made absolutely zero sense. Shanann had just gotten back from a business trip in Arizona at 2 in the morning. When her friend, Nicole Atkinson, who actually dropped her off, couldn't reach her later that morning and realized she had missed a crucial prenatal appointment, she called the police. And inside the home, police found a terrifyingly pristine scene. Shanann's purse, which had her keys and her phone, was still there. Her essential lupus medication was just left behind, and perhaps the most disturbing detail of all, completely shattering the illusion of a happy marriage, her wedding ring was sitting right there, abandoned on the couple's bed.
Now, there is a totally jarring contrast between their public facade and their private reality. If you were just scrolling through Shanann's social media, you saw this deeply loving, incredibly successful family living in a gorgeous $400,000 five-bedroom home in Frederick, Colorado. It looked idyllic, but behind closed doors, the private reality was a waking nightmare. Just a few years prior, the couple had to seek Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection. They claimed nearly $450,000 in liabilities against a combined income of only about $100,000. So there was this immense, crushing financial stress hiding just behind those smiling selfies. As investigators started really digging into their lives, building what would become a massive 2,000-page discovery file, they uncovered hidden clues that painted a picture of a marriage in absolute freefall. Shanann's mother immediately told police she suspected foul play, pointing out that Chris had been acting incredibly cold. Investigators also discovered a canceled gender reveal party for their unborn son, Nico. It was scrubbed because of this sudden, bizarre tension in the house. And then they found a deeply heartbreaking detail, a marriage self-help book called Hold Me Tight. Shanann had given it to Chris to try and fix their relationship. Police found it coldly tossed straight into the recycling bin. While police are inside the house finding these massive clues, Chris is standing outside giving local television interviews, practically pleading for his family's safe return. But we have to wonder, what was the suspect hiding during these public appearances? Almost immediately, behavioral experts watching the broadcast noticed some glaring red flags. His words were saying one thing, but his nonverbal behavior was telegraphing something entirely different. He was standing on his own front porch, talking to reporters, but he just didn't look like a terrified father whose family was missing.
A closer analysis of his interview reveals a whole cascade of deceptive behaviors. Just seconds in, he repeatedly licks his lips. Now that is a classic sign of severe dry mouth, which is triggered by the reptilian brain's response to extreme stress. When he spells out his youngest daughter's name, he tightly closes his eyes, a subconscious blocking behavior to avoid seeing a horrific reality. At one point, while literally saying he just wants them back, he actually laughs. He smiles inappropriately, and when the camera pans back out, he's standing there with his arms crossed tightly across his chest, physically cradling and self-comforting himself. The story just wasn't adding up.
But what did investigators miss in those crucial early hours while Chris was out playing the victim on the local news? Well, they were about to uncover a massive, hidden secret that completely shattered his alibi. By combing through his phone records, they discovered Chris was having an intense affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger.
And this wasn't just some brief fling, it was a deeply involved relationship that had started nearly 2 months prior, full of explicit texts and frequent meetups. So while Shanann was desperately trying to save her marriage, Chris was literally looking up secluded vacation getaways with his mistress. The whole grieving husband routine, it was a complete fabrication.
When investigators finally brought Kessinger in for questioning, she provided some incredible insight. She told the Colorado Bureau of Investigation that Chris had completely lied to her. He claimed he was at the very end of a divorce, and he totally hid the fact that Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant. Kessinger even recalled visiting his home once and finding him sleeping on a bare mattress without any sheets, and she remembered sensing that things were highly unusual. But most importantly, she noticed a chilling, dark shift in his demeanor during their very last date, right before the disappearance.
And this brings us to a really fascinating micro-cliffhanger from their date on August 11th. Throughout their entire affair, Kessinger noted that Chris always, without fail, paid for their dates using gift cards. It was an obvious tactic to hide his tracks from his wife's financial monitoring. But on that Saturday night, just hours before the murders, something fundamentally changed. Chris suddenly pulled out his personal credit card to pay for dinner. As Kessinger told investigators, it was like he suddenly had nothing to hide. Or, chillingly, nothing to lose.
Cornered by his phone records and a spectacularly failed polygraph test where he actually scored among the lowest possible numbers, Chris finally cracked. But could there be another explanation for the disappearance? Well, Chris offered a twisted, fabricated confession. He told police that yes, he did indeed kill Shanann, but he claimed it was in a sudden blinding rage. His story was that after he asked for a separation, Shanann snapped and smothered the girls, and he strangled her in retaliation. But investigators knew immediately that this calculated lie was just another desperate attempt to shift the blame.
To figure out if his sudden rage story held any water at all, investigators and psychologists looked at the specific profile of a family annihilator. This is a very specific type of perpetrator who murders their entire family. Historically, experts note these horrific crimes are usually motivated by a sudden loss of access to the children, intense shame surrounding financial ruin, a deeply twisted sense of a mercy killing, or a severe psychotic break, and very often, these acts are followed almost immediately by the perpetrator taking their own life.
But when you compare this psychological profile to Chris Watts, he breaks the traditional mold completely. Experts note that most family annihilators threaten suicide before the act, saying things like, "I'll kill myself if you leave." Chris, he showed zero suicidal ideation. He had no criminal record and absolutely no reported history of physical domestic violence. And most chillingly of all, he showed absolutely no remorse. This wasn't a sudden explosive snap from a man losing his family. This was something far darker and far more deeply premeditated.
Let's look at the timeline here, because this builds to the ultimate, terrifying twist. Chris didn't act in a sudden rage at all. He had been meticulously planning this mass murder for weeks. In a letter he wrote later from prison, Chris coldly stated that he wished he had listened to the Lord calling him back in June, July, and August. On August 12th, the day before the murders, he specifically called a coworker to ensure he would be the only one heading out to a remote oil site the following morning. He knew exactly what he was going to do long before Shanann ever walked through that front door at 2 a.m.
Chris ultimately confessed to the full, gruesome reality of that morning. After strangling Shanann in their bed, he loaded her body along with his 2 living daughters into his work truck. He drove them out to that remote Anadarko Petroleum work site he had so carefully secured the day prior. Once there, he buried his pregnant wife in a shallow grave. He then methodically smothered 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste with a blanket and dropped their little bodies into massive 400-barrel crude tanks. And afterwards, he simply stayed at the work site, casually texting his mistress and acting completely normal when his coworkers eventually showed up.
The justice system moved swiftly after that. Faced with insurmountable evidence and the recovered location of the bodies, Chris pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. It was a decision supported by Shannon's family, who simply didn't want any further bloodshed. At his emotional sentencing, Shannon's father, Frank Razuchek, looked directly at Chris and said, "You heartless monster. You don't know what love is, or you would not have killed them." The judge called it perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever handled, sentencing Chris to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole.
But shockingly, the story doesn't actually end with a prison door slamming shut. A bizarre and deeply unsettling online subculture has emerged in the aftermath of this tragedy. Researchers analyzing internet culture have documented the disturbing rise of what they call dark fandoms. These are online communities that express a perverse fascination with, and sometimes even a defense of, the perpetrators of violent crimes. And somehow, Chris Watts has become the center of one of these digital ecosystems.
Researchers studied a specific community forum called r/Watts Off Topic, and what they found is truly alarming. The community actively works to construct Chris not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a victim. They dissect Shanann's old social media videos, essentially weaponizing her own posts to blame her for the murders. They highlight Chris's previously passive traits and argue that he simply went into a fight-or-flight mode. They purposefully reduce his agency in the crime, shifting the blame entirely onto the pregnant woman he murdered, establishing this toxic narrative that completely ignores the cold hard facts of his premeditation.
Which brings us to the end of this dark journey. The Watts case leaves us grappling with a terrifying reality that completely shatters our sense of suburban security. Think about it. If a man with no criminal record, no history of violence, and a seemingly perfect life can meticulously plan and execute the annihilation of his entire family, how well do we really know the people around us? It forces us to confront the darkness that can hide in plain sight, right behind closed doors, and right behind the smiling filters of a social media feed. What do you think you would have seen if you lived next door?